Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be your host this evening. This afternoon, I'm Michael Birnbaum. Actually, we could say this afternoon, this evening, or even this morning, depending on where people are. And I'm here on behalf of the Holocaust Memorial of Miami Beach. We've been running a multi-part series. We began with a general introduction to the Holocaust by me, with Peter Hayes' presentation on why, with John Roth's presentation on the ethics of the Holocaust, Michael Basler's presentation on the Holocaust and legal implications. We also had Carol Rittner on the Holocaust and women. And today we're going to culminate our series for this spring with Professor Lawrence Barron, who had the Nassiter Chair of Modern European Jewish History at San Diego State University from 1988 until 2012, and directed the Jewish Studies program to 2006. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin, studying with one of the great historians of the last generation, George Mosse, who himself was not merely a historian, but also a refugee from the Holocaust, and devoted his career to understanding it. And he's taught at St. Lawrence University. He's authored 4 books, and he has served as a historian interviewer for the Sam and Pearl Olinar's The Altruistic Personality, Rescuers of Jews in Nazi Europe, and has delivered the keynote at Yad Vashem's first conference devoted to the Holocaust and Hollywood. His contribution to Holocaust studies was profiled in 50 Key Thinkers on the Holocaust, and he served, as I did, as the Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Richard Stockton University. Lawrence Barron's knowledge of film is encyclopedic, but not merely encyclopedic, it's also insightful. And I know that we are about to have an extraordinarily interesting encounter with the Holocaust in film. Lawrence, please take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me, and the Miami Holocaust Memorial for hosting this. And I'm very appreciative also to Abraham, who has been doing the sound and the clips for me. So thank you very much. What constitutes a Holocaust film? If you think about it, do you automatically think this is going to be a film about Jews? It's going to be very harrowing. It's going to be about concentration camps or ghettos. It's going to be pretty bleak, and it may have a happy ending, but much in the movie, diminishes that happiness. And there are some people who argue, whether it be literature or movies, that when the Holocaust is portrayed, the representations of this must focus on the persecution and extermination of Jews, be bleak, and avoid imposing uplifting endings. And that should always be the standard. And the movies I'm going to talk about today, which are the first Holocaust movies that came out of Hollywood between 1945 and 1959, don't fit that category very well. And they've been sort of dismissed as this is part of Hollywood and America's silence about the Holocaust in the immediate post-war period. People didn't want to deal with this. I take a bit of a different interpretation with this, which is what we call Constructivism, which comes from Alan Mintz's book on the Holocaust and popular culture. And he says, all historical events, even the Holocaust, possess no inscribed meanings. Meanings are constructed by communities of interpretation differently by different communities out of their own motives and needs in accordance with the needs of the time and conditions of the time. So how the Holocaust is depicted changes over time based on the country where it was made, when it was made, who is making the film, what do people know generally about the Holocaust in that period. And so I'm going to look at these movies from that perspective. And one of the things is everyone always says the Holocaust was unprecedented, incomprehensible, and how much more so in 1945, when, yes, we had information. We saw the pictures, the footage of the camps, and there had been exposés. 1942, the Allies condemned in a joint statement what was going on in Europe. But if you read that joint statement, they didn't understand it very well. They said people were disappearing, being deported. They didn't come back. They were being sent to places where they were worked or starved to death. And a couple of 100,000 people were dead. Many more were dead by then. And even when the news filtered in from the Auschwitz report in April during the summer of 1944, and from Russian pictures of Majdanek, which had been liberated, how much of that sunk in, we don't know. In fact, I think I can give you a good idea from the movies. The one movie that you could call a Holocaust movie that came out of World War II in Hollywood is a movie called None Shall Escape, which is kind of a prequel Nuremberg trial of a German who's responsible for persecuting the Poles and ultimately deporting the Jews in the town that he's in charge of in Poland. He gives a talk, he's explaining, and it has the first deportation scene. Most movies are about individuals. They're intermarried or they're adopted, or it's an intermarried couple. But this movie is about a collective. Jews are being collectively persecuted, and they're being deported. And when one of the young German soldier asks his uncle, where are they being sent to? And he says, well, we're sending them to this place. We don't have enough food. They're probably going to die or work to death, but some of them will survive. That's basically the 1942 account. That's what a movie thought in 1944, what was happening to the Jews. But there were other reasons why it was difficult to make a movie about the Holocaust. One was Hollywood's self-censorship. It had imposed upon itself to avoid federal regulation and censorship, production code in 1930. It didn't really get enforced until 1934. But basically, this was because movies were not seen as free speech, but were seen as interstate commerce by a Supreme Court ruling. And so states and localities could censor movies, and to forestall federal censorship, Hollywood adopted these own guidelines. And these guidelines are very specific when it comes to violence. Brutal killings are not to be presented in detail. Repellent subjects must be treated within the limits of good taste. Brutality and possible gruesomeness cannot be shown. The branding of people, I don't know why they had the branding of people in something from 1930, but they had it, cannot be shown. And there were two other parts of this which delayed Hollywood from dealing with the Holocaust. One was you're not supposed to ridicule a particular nation. You must present them fairly. And because Germany was threatening to boycott American movies or the films of any studio that was critical of the Nazi policies, it took well until 1939 to make a movie directly critical of Nazi Germany. And Hollywood was also very aware that their anti-Semitism was running at a high level in the 30s, and that the perception was Jews controlled Hollywood, and they were going to do special pleading for Jewish people and get us involved in what became World War II. And the sentiment in this country was not to get involved. So there wasn't much being done in terms of dealing with the Jews in the 1930s until really 1937 and 39, you start having some of that beginning to happen. But during the war, basically this policy was continued. There now was a federal mandate coming out of what was called the Bureau of Motion Pictures, which was part of the Office of War Information. They issued guidelines, and they were very specific as well. There are still groups in this country who are thinking only in terms of their particular group. Some citizens have not been made aware of the fact that this is a people's war, not a group war. And what that meant for Jews was when, after the Allies announced this joint declaration and Jewish groups petitioned the Hollywood to make a film specifically about what was happening to the Jews, they got this response. It might be unwise from the standpoint of the Jews themselves to have a picture dealing solely with Hitler's treatment of their people, because the Nazis claimed the US was fighting the war on behalf of the Jews. but interest has been indicated in the possibility of a picture covering various groups, including the Jews. And that's what basically happened. Even in the movie None Shall Escape, Poles are being persecuted as well, so it was okay. After the war, when those horrific pictures came out of the camps that the American Signal Corps and the Russian soldiers took, and they were made into newsreels and used at the Nuremberg trials, and they were shown widely. You can see pictures of marquees announcing that they were showing the atrocity footage in 1945 and 46. There was something new that was there, and many, as you probably know, many important Hollywood directors were part of making those films. They were part of the Army Signal Corps, and then they made some of the films. Billy Wilder, for example, made the film Nazi Death Mills. And so they knew what was terrible that had happened, but knowing something and comprehending it are two different things. And I think that's what's going on between 1945 and 1959, in part, is Hollywood is trying to grapple with what this is. And what they do is they put the Holocaust into existing categories, existing genres, and existing methods of making films and existing rules. And so the Holocaust comes off as what they deal with from the Holocaust comes off as very tame. And the first thing they focus on is anti-Semitism. The Holocaust, Jews were persecuted. We don't want this to happen in the United States, and we know from public opinion polls taken during the war and before the war, a large percentage of Americans held anti-Semitic attitudes. In the last one in 1944 was the high point, was like about 44%. And so Hollywood decided to deal with the Holocaust. We'll equate it with, anti-Semitism in the United States. So I'm going to show you a clip from a short that ended up winning an Oscar, The House I Live In, 1945. This is Frank Sinatra. And let's just roll that clip and then I'll talk a little bit about it.
Somebody in for a licking?
You bet. Bring a smear.
Yeah, but 10 against 1. That's not very fair.
Ah, come on.
What's it all about?
None of your business.
Scared to tell me?
No, I'm not scared. I'll fight you even.
Not if I can help it. I just want to know why the gang war.
We don't like him. We don't want him in our neighborhood or going to our school. I've been living here as long as you.
What's he got, smallpox or something?
We don't like his religion.
His religion?
Look, mister, he's a dirt...
Now, hold on. I see what you mean. You must be a bunch of those Nazi werewolves I've been reading about.
Mister, are you screwy?
Not me. I'm an American.
Well, what do you think we are?
Nazis?
Don't call me a Nazi. My father's a sergeant in the army. He's been wounded even.
Wounded, huh? Say, I bet he got some of that blood plasma.
He was wounded so bad he had to get it 3 times.
Son, anybody in your family ever go to the blood bank?
Sure, my mother and my father both.
Uh-huh. You know what? I bet you maybe his pop's blood helped save your dad's life. That's bad.
What's bad about it?
Well, don't you see? Your father doesn't go to the same church as his father does. That's awful. Do you think maybe if your father knew about it in time, he would rather have died than to take blood from a man of another religion? Would you have wanted him to die? Would your mom want him to die?
No.
Look, fellas, religion makes no difference, except maybe to a Nazi or somebody as stupid. Why, people all over the world worship God in many different ways. God created everybody. He didn't create one people better than another. Your blood's the same as mine. Mine's the same as his. Do you know what this wonderful country is made of? It's made up of 100 different kind of people, and 100 different ways of talking, and 100 different ways of going to church. But they're all American ways. Wouldn't we be silly if we went around hating people because they comb their hair different than ours? Wouldn't we be a lot of dopes? My dad came from Italy, but I'm an American. But should I hate your father because he came from Ireland or France or Russia? Wouldn't I be a first-class fathead?
So you can get the idea there, and if you know the song, that this, at the end, he sings this song, The House I Live In. which is probably the least militaristic patriotic song ever written. And it was written by two left-wing authors, one of whom was Abe Maripol. This was the couple that adopted the Rosenberg children after their parents were executed. The film was written by Albert Maltz, who was also a communist, had been a communist in the 30s, and became critical of the Communist Party when the Soviet Union made its pact with it, and also that it wasn't taking anti-Semitism seriously. And so he wrote this, but Sinatra also was interested in this. He had toured the South. He was shocked by segregation, but he also, when he heard what was happening to Jews during World War II, he would give away St. Christopher medals, which had a Jewish star on the other side, so that to remind people of this. And yet you can see there's a certain timidness there. He's a dirty, but they never say the word Jew. You can gather it's not just about religion, it's about blood. And this is about anti-Nazism, but it's there. And this becomes a movie that previews a number of other movies that would come out. There already are Jewish characters, important Jewish GIs coming back, like in the movie Pride of the Marines in 1945. But you have the two big movies tackling anti-Semitism in 1947, Crossfire and Gentleman's Agreement, which both did very well. And then something happened in 1948, which was the integration of the American military. And in 1949, you have a number of movies come out about blacks and prejudice against blacks. What's interesting, at least about one of them, Home of the Brave, they were originally about Jews and about Jews encountering discrimination in the army, and they just transferred it over to blacks and didn't change the script very much. And throughout the 50s, that tends to be something that happens, is that black characters replace Jewish characters when you're talking about prejudice. So that was the initial response. But very early on, the US, how did we perceive what happened? Well, we perceived ourselves as the good guys. We fought Germany, we liberated the camps, we hunted Nazi war criminals, we tried Nazi war criminals, we took care of displaced persons and they could come here, or we helped them to get to Israel. And so most of the movies that are made by the United States after the war, made in Hollywood after the war, are movies about the aftermath and what the United States is doing. They're not set in the Holocaust. Jews are sometimes characters. They're not necessarily named as such, or they're certainly secondary characters. And so I'm going to talk about that with a movie that comes out in 1946, The Stranger, which is Orson Welles' movie about hunting down a Nazi war criminal by the name of Franz Kindler, who is the equivalent of Martin Bormann. Welles was very anti-fascist. He was shocked at what had happened by the pictures that came out after the war and then by the Nuremberg trials. And he wanted to focus on hunting this guy who it strains credibility, but if you think of a Nazi war criminal coming to the United States, mastering English so well that he's able to get a job teaching German history at a New England college and no one realizes who he is. And then he marries Mary, Loretta Young, and she doesn't know who he is. But Edward G. Robinson is hunting him and finally locates him in this little town. And he knows that his wife, that Kindler's wife, has seen another Nazi that they let go, hoping he would lead them to Kindler, who then Kindler killed, that she's the last person who saw this person alive. So he wants to, get her to testify. And the way he does it is through the films used at Nuremberg. And so this is the scene there.
I've been showing your father some films, and I'd like you to see them too. I'm on the Allied Commission for the Punishment of War Criminals. It's my job to bring escaped Nazis to justice. It's that job that brought me to Harper.
Well, surely you don't think that... Mr. Wilson, I've never so much as even seen a Nazi.
Well, you might without you realizing it. They look like other people and act like other people when it's to their benefit. A gas chamber, Mrs. Rankin. The candidates were first given hot showers so that their pores would be open and the gas would act that much more quickly. And this is a lime pit in which hundreds of men, women, and children were buried alive.
Why do you want me to look at these horrors?
All this you're seeing, it's all the product of one mind. The mind of a man named Franz Kindler.
Franz Kindler?
Yes, he was the most brilliant of the younger minds from the Nazi Party. It was Kindler who conceived the theory of genocide, mass depopulation of conquered countries, so that regardless of who won the war, Germany would emerge the strongest nation in Western Europe, biologically speaking.
You can hear a number of those mistakes in there. I don't remember Jews getting hot showers before going into gas chambers. And the definition of genocide is clearly not the right definition. But remember, the term genocide didn't even exist until 1944. This is the first time it appears in a feature film. Also the first time that atrocity footage from the liberation of the camps appears in a feature film. And you wonder, where did he get this? And there's no mention of Jews, if you've noticed that. Though earlier on, the character that Wells plays, who is this war criminal, does indicate that he's an anti-Semite in a conversation over dinner, that he doesn't view Jews as capable of being Germans. But that's really all we know from that. Yet, given it's 1946, I mean, the Nuremberg trials are still going on. Well, when this movie comes out, it's made in late 1945, and this movie became the most commercially successful movie that Orson Welles ever made. He hated it, by the way, because they cut a lot of the stuff that he wanted in it out of it, and he didn't have as much control over the script as he usually does, but it was his most commercially successful movie. It won an Oscar, it earned an Oscar nomination for Best Screenplay. And it's clear the Germans are guilty of committing genocide. And even though he doesn't say Jews, the other thing is, if you see these pictures, you become a witness. You've become a witness. You've seen these things now, Loretta Young, the character Mary. Now you have to act on this and do something and tell us who your husband saw so that we can arrest him. In any case, another way which the U.S., and a movie I'm not showing you, but there were two of these movies, and there would be several later on, is the Americans in various trials, war crimes trials. The first one was None Shall Escape, which was this prequel. There's one called Sealed Verdict, which comes out in 1948 with Ray Milland. And then, of course, Judgment at Nuremberg, which starts out as a television drama and then becomes a movie in the 1960s. But again, it's the US. We're going to make sure that justice prevails. Another thing that the US prides itself on is we're going to take care of the displaced persons. We're going to help rehabilitate them. And the movie which does this is a movie called The Search, which comes out in 1948. And the background of this movie is interesting. It's made by Fred Zinnemann. Zinnemann himself, was many of the directors was an immigrant from Europe, from Vienna. He came in the late 20s and then made social documentaries in the 30s and started making feature films in the 40s. His first film, in fact, was about an escape from a concentration camp called The Seventh Cross in 1944. But MGM had him on a contract to make a number of fluffy movies. And he had this opportunity with a Swiss company to make a movie about displaced children in the DP camps. During the course of this, he learned that his parents had died in the Holocaust. They had been deported to Poland. He later on, Yad Vashem, was able to locate, his father died in Belzec and his mother in Auschwitz. But he learned this, and he was very interested in telling this story and telling the story of these children. And he was able to interview and go through DP camps run by the UN and interview children who were in them. And in the process of interviewing them, he shifted the movie. The movie was originally supposed to be a movie about how we had locked up all these people in DP camps with Nazi collaborators and Germans who were guilty, and we weren't doing enough to denazify. And there were two children. One was a Gentile girl and the other was a Jewish boy who escaped the camp and then tried to get adopted. Of course, the Christian girl gets adopted and no one wants to adopt the Jewish boy. Zinnemann felt that that was too much of a downer, and he wanted to pay tribute, not criticize the Allies, but pay tribute to the children. And so he makes these films, this film, which is originally supposed to have a Jewish character, a Jewish boy as the lead, but he changes that Jewish boy into a Czechoslovakian boy whose mother was arrested because she was a political dissident. When they bring these children in, the imagery is Holocaust imagery. They come in on a train, they look like they're dead bodies. And then as they arrive in the displaced person camp, they get new life, they awaken. And then they are interviewed. And I want to show you the scene of the interview. Again, no mention of Jews, but if you know enough, you can figure out that the middle girl here is Jewish. So let's show that. Oh, this isn't it. Abraham? Yeah, wrong one.
Apologies. Which one?
The Search.
Oh, apologies for that. Skipped ahead.
Comment tu t'appelles?
Raoul Dubois. Nous habitions Belfort. J'ai 11 ans.
Élève nièce Thompson Belfort. Et ton religion? Catholique sans doute.
Oui, je suis toujours allée à l'église avec ma mère.
Religion catholique. Où est ta mère maintenant?
Ils l'ont coincée. Ils l'ont attrapée et emmenée je ne sais pas où.
Mother taken away where he doesn't know.
And his father?
Et ton père a-t-il aussi été enlevé par les Allemands?
Mon père a rejoint le maquis. C'était un héros, mon père. Mais il a été fusillé.
Father killed with the partisans.
Moi, j'étais dans la forêt. On était 16. Ils ont mis long avant de nous trouver. Pour finir, ils m'ont attrapé et mis dans un camp.
He says he himself lived in a forest for months with a whole gang, but they caught him and put him in a concentration camp.
Which camp?
Quel camp?
Mauthausen.
Mauthausen, yes.
C'est bien. Assis-toi.
It's all right. Tell him to sit down.
Come on, Victor.
Next, Jadwiga Bronowska.
Chodź tu.
To jest mój brat. My jesteśmy razem.
He's her brother. Siadaj, Jadwigo.
Nigdyśmy nikomu nic złego nie zrobili. Ojciec mój był nauczycielem muzyki w Piotrkowie. Naprawdę nigdyśmy nikomu nic złego nie zrobili. Spytajcie się mego brata. Oni naszych rodziców wysłali do Bergen-Belsen. Brat się schował, a ja musiałam bardzo ciężko harować. Później znalazłam brata. Ja jestem dla niego wszystkim.
Father music teacher in Piotrków, Poland. Both parents killed at Bergen-Belsen.
And she was in slave labor. Is that what she said?
Yes, sir.
I see.
Miriam Szigeti, parents domicile Budapest, both gassed at Dachau.
Ruhákat kellett összeraknom nagyság szerint. Közvetlen a krematórium mellett. Anyám blúzát is megtaláltam közöttük.
What did she say?
Her job was to sort out the clothes of the people who had been gassed. She had to sort them according to size in a room next to the crematorium. She found her own mother's blouse among them.
Well, say something to her. Anything.
Minden jóra fog neked fordulni, Miriam.
Igen, köszönöm.
The last boy is the main character. His name is Carol, and he's the son of a dissident. But the second, Miriam Szigeti, Hungarian Jew, no gassing at Dachau. There was a gas chamber there, but the people who were gassed from Dachau went to Hartheim. They were part of the euthanasia program, but nonetheless, gassing is there, and that's reinforced, by the way, when the children some of the children who are having more trouble adjusting are being taken away. They're put in an ambulance, and they immediately associate this ambulance with a gas fan, with a German gas fan, and they panic and break out of it. And so that's there. Now, why did Zinnemann make his character a Christian? I think he did it for popular appeal, but there is another character in here by the name of Joel Markowski. Joel is initially, when this boy runs away, his mother is looking for him. When Carol runs away, Joel claims that he is Carol, and she finds this boy and realizes it isn't him. And this is a boy who's been a choir boy, an altar boy, and he's obviously not Jewish, except it turns out he is. And he says, I never said it because my mother told me never to say I'm Jewish. It's too dangerous. He ends up being among a group of the kids that are in the camp who are going to Palestine. And we get the number for the first time of 6 million. There's a sign that says 6 million. There's Yiddish written underneath. We see a picture of Herzl, and they are the happier kids. And we're told the majority of kids in the camp indeed are Jewish. So there is a Jewish element in it. Yet Zinnemann readily conceded. He said, I softened the truth to a certain extent because to show things as they really were would have meant that American audiences would have lost any desire to face it. And so we have this problem of commerce, yet the movie was very successful. It won 2 Oscars and became a movie that was shown in lots of church groups and schools. And it got the idea across that terrible things had happened. Now, what are you going to do with all these DPs? One thing would be to bring them to the United States. And there were, in fact, movies, a movie called The Glass Wall, which dealt with that issue. But most of them dealt with taking them to Palestine in 1948, as you already saw in here. And so, again, we're dealing with the aftermath of the war, but we're beginning to shift more to Jewish characters in the 50s. And why this shift, I'm going to talk about in a second, but I want to show one more of these films because this is a film called The Juggler. It wasn't the first American film about resettling Holocaust survivors in Palestine. There was one called Sword of the Desert that came out in 1949. But this one deals with a broken, used to be a clown and a juggler, and very famous in Germany. He thought his fame would protect him and his family from being persecuted. It didn't. His wife and children died in a camp. Now he's been sent to Israel. He's in a transit camp, but he views the camp as a prison, as another prison camp, and he views the Israelis as Nazis. And he's very psychologically disturbed. And so let's show the clip from The Juggler.
Maybe you've seen him, huh? Oh, please take a look. My son from Warsaw. Have you seen him? Huh? Oh, please take a look. Have you seen my son? Huh? No?
I beg your pardon.
Yes.
You from Germany?
Yes.
Those yours?
Yes.
How long have you been here?
3 months.
You live in a concentration camp? Darling. Can I have Hans? Don't you recognize me?
I'm afraid you are mistaken.
I am Hans. I'm your husband, darling. Marie, I'm your father.
Please. If you tell me a little more, perhaps I can help you.
You're lying to me. Look at me, look.
Can I help you?
Darling,
I don't know him.
Look at me. Get where?
Hans, what are you doing? It's all right, officer. It's all right. I'll take care of him.
You're Israel, full of policemen.
Come on, Hans. Come on.
David doesn't recognize
Your family's dead, I've told you. You saw the certificate.
Yes, of course. I don't know what came over me. I apologize. I regret that I caused you and your children. All right, I'm going. You're very fortunate. My wife's hair was blonde.
This movie is beginning to set up, we're moving now into what becomes more mainstream Holocaust movies. The image of the survivor initially was not a positive image. And it's usually of someone who was psychologically damaged. And you begin to see this in this. You also see this in these movies about children. The young boy Carol initially can't remember his name, can't remember where he came from, doesn't know what languages he speaks. In here he ends up beating up an Israeli policeman who asks for his identity and then becoming a fugitive. And finally, he's helped by the love of a good kibbutznik woman and a young boy at a kibbutz that he needs psychological help. But the preview of The Pawnbroker is there. You have the sort of roots of that kind of movie. Why the shift, though, to the Jewish character and the beginnings of dealing more with the war more directly? I'm speculating here, but I think there's a number of reasons. One is there were best-selling books coming out already about what had happened. The Wall about the Warsaw Ghetto came out in 1950. Anne Frank in 1950.
Barry, would you just repeat the name of the film? Somebody asked.
Oh, that was The Juggler. And there should be a handout listed on the chat, which lists all the films that I'm doing. So that I'm showing clips from. In any case, let's go back. So you have these depictions, beginning depictions of Jewish characters, more focused on them than on what the US is doing, and of placing it within the context of the Holocaust, not after it. Part of this has to do with movies where this was being covered. In the 1940s, it's estimated that 2/3 of the American public weekly went to a movie. That stopped with the advent of television. Still had a large number, but it almost dropped by 1/3 during the 1950s because of television. Television also, because it had much more time. You had to fill in all these 18 hours of space. They didn't do programming from midnight usually until 6 in the morning, but you had a lot of programming to fill in. And there were programs that dealt with the Holocaust. Not in ways we would necessarily view as positive today. The famous one is This Is Your Life, which brings a Holocaust survivor by the name of Hannah Kroner. In interviewing her and bringing the people from her life, it's clear that Ralph Edwards doesn't understand what it meant to be in a concentration camp and the trauma that caused. But nonetheless, a Holocaust survivors on TV. There was what was called the Sunday Ghetto. And these were shows, I remember watching these religious shows, of which there were some Jewish shows on Sunday mornings. And the Jewish ones showed Holocaust-related material occasionally. The first production of a dramatization of Anne Frank's life occurs in 1952 on one of these shows, one of these morning shows. There were documentaries about World War II. And my father was an avid documentary fan. And so I remember watching these, which was called The Twisted Cross, which came out in 1956 about Nazi Germany. Not a lot about Jews, but there's enough, and the atrocity footage is in there that you would know what had happened. So those sorts of things. And then there were what we call the drama anthologies, Playhouse 90, Armstrong Circle. And these were live plays. And a number of them, in fact, a number of movies came out of Holocaust movies came out of them, including Judgment at Nuremberg. But they dealt with Holocaust themes, and often with Jews inside in the Holocaust. For example, there's one called The Final Ingredient, about Jews commemorating and observing Pesach in a concentration camp, and how they put it together. That's 1956. So these things were happening. So movies needed to compete, or at least bring that material in. The power of the production code weakened because in the 1950s there were several Supreme Court rulings which ended the idea that films were interstate commerce and not free speech. And so that stopped occurring. And so you could start doing things. There was also the competition against foreign movies. For the first time, Americans were interested in foreign movies. And some of these foreign movies, especially the ones in the late 40s, but also from about 1957 on, a number of these foreign movies started dealing much more directly with the Holocaust as a legacy of their own country. Again, in ways that we would not find appropriate. The communists are the great heroes in Eastern Europe, or things like that, or the French always resisted it, these nasty Nazis who made us do these things. But nonetheless, these movies start coming out, and Hollywood needs to compete with those movies. And finally, though there's initially a reluctance to tackle, to be too negative towards Germany in the early 50s, out of a sense that you'd be accused of being a communist because you're criticizing one of our allies, West Germany. That lessens with the end of McCarthyism as well. And so by the end of the 50s, you start having a number of movies dealing more directly with Nazism, with German responsibility, and with the toll it took on Jews. And I'm just going to look at two of those to finish up. One is a movie called The Young Lions. The Young Lions often gets criticized because it has a rather positive portrayal, or at least a neutral portrayal of a German soldier, of a good German soldier played by Marlon Brando. In the novel that it's based on, The Young Lions from Irwin Shaw, he's not such a positive character by the end. But in this one, he joins the Nazis only because he votes for them, only because he's unemployed in 1933, and he thinks Hitler will bring back jobs. He doesn't see himself as fighting a racial war, but he ends up doing racial things and massacring or arresting citizens, and eventually massacring British soldiers who are in the process of surrendering. But it isn't until the end of the war that he stumbles upon a concentration camp after he flees his unit, and he learns what a concentration camp is about because the commandant tells him, we have a quota of killing 1,500 people a day. We kill Jews. He mentions lots of other people. And you should note in these things, the number 6 million is very rare. The number is usually 20 million or 30 million because Jews are seen as one of the casualties of World War, German casualties of World War II, not just as a separate group. But in the process of telling this, Marlon Brando's character is totally destroyed by what he's been fighting for. He goes out and he's going to snipe against 2 American soldiers who he sees in a clearing, but then he decides to surrender to them and actually to invite them killing him. And he's sacrificed almost Christ-like. A lot of that has to do with Brando, who wanted this character to be like that. But within this is there's a Jewish character who's an American soldier who is the victim of anti-Semitism, fights his way through the army through basic training, eventually gets recognized as a good soldier by his comrades. And then there is, towards the end, the liberation of a camp. And the liberation of the camp is based on the director, Edward Dimtrick, who also, by the way, made The Juggler, and made Crossfire, which is one of the movies about anti-Semitism. Dimtrick viewed the atrocity footage, rented a former concentration camp in France for the setting, and basically tried to recreate a concentration camp rather than use the original footage. And you'll see that scene briefly, and then you'll see a scene afterwards in which a Jewish character is given agency. And so we're going to look at that scene.
is the mayor of the town we just came through on our way up here. He says he can send a gang of civilians in to help us.
As I was telling the sergeant, Captain, we have heard that some of your most important generals and newspapermen are on their way up here. I can provide you with a number of my townspeople who will help you to clean up this place so that...
Excuse me. My name is Joseph Silverson. I am a rabbi.
Yes?
I do not wish to annoy the officer, but I have a request to make.
Yes, what is it?
Thousands have died here. More will die tonight, tomorrow.
Sorry, Rabbi, we're doing all we can.
Of course, I know that. There's nothing to be done for them. Nothing material, we understand that. All efforts must be for the living. What I am asking for is a luxury.
Yes?
I ask to be permitted to collect all of us, the living and those without hope, and hold a religious service. A service for the dead who have come to their end here. There has never been a religious service for us in this place.
And those two soldiers you saw, one is Montgomery Clift, who plays the Jewish soldier, and the other is Dean Martin, who plays an Italian entertainer who volunteers for the army. But the important thing here is after they leave this setting, and by the way, the commander does not, the mayor of the German town says, you shouldn't do this, it'll anger the prisoners. We shouldn't deal with these, deal just with these Jewish sensibilities. And the commander basically bans the mayor from ever coming to there again and says he'll put machine guns up and shoot anybody who tries to disrupt the services. So again, the Americans turn out to be the heroes. But the Jewish soldier that Montgomery Clift plays, as they're leaving, Dean Martin leaves the camp and they say, did you ever imagine there were places like this? And Montgomery Clift's character says, my uncle died in one of them. And so things come full circle. So we now have a Jewish character emerging, and it's right at the end of the war. In '58, we also have the movie Me and the Colonel with Danny Kaye about a Jew trying to escape being caught by the Germans. He links up with a Polish colonel. And so we have a central Jewish character. But of course, the most famous is the Diary of Anne Frank. Probably the one source the most responsible for Americanizing the Holocaust and popularizing it. It was issued in an English edition in 1952. It inspired a radio play and a television program that year, and eventually a play that would be written by veteran Hollywood writers and Broadway writers, much to the dismay of Mayor Levin, who had written the radio play and wanted it to be much more Jewish and much more Zionist as well. But the director who took on the film, George Stevens, had been the head of the Army Signal Corps. He had made the movie German concentration camps, which was used at Nuremberg. And he certainly knew what had happened. He interviewed Otto Frank. Otto Frank liked the movie and he liked the play, which people often accuse of being too universal and not being Jewish enough and not showing enough of the horrors. But that's exactly what Otto Frank wanted. Otto Frank wanted his daughter's story to be a universal story, not to be a narrow story. And so Stevens consulted with him. He visited Dachau, which he had been at when it was liberated, to rekindle the indignation he felt back then. And the movie, basically follows the diary, and it's about inside. You're not going to see much of what's going out. He decided not to do that. But the movie and the play have been excoriated for relegating anti-Semitism to just another form of prejudice, minimizing Anne's Jewish identity, emphasizing her romance and her parental relationships, which are all part of the diary, and glossing over the horrors of the Holocaust, particularly with Anne's statement, believing that all people are really good at heart, which she says not only in the movie, but at the end, it's the last thing you hear in the movie. And by casting Millie Perkins, who was a fashion model, who didn't look very particularly Jewish and who didn't sound, had a Midwestern accent. As someone once said, if anything, she was more Marjorie Morningstar than Anne Frank. But all of this led to audiences being able to identify with Anne. They were like an American family. And why would you want an American family to go through this? But I think the charge that of the Jewishness is unfounded in many ways. When they arrive, we see Otto, who comes on a truck. The people are wearing their prison uniforms, their concentration camp uniforms, at least one of the people on the truck is. He reads Anne's diary, and the first words are about going into hiding because all these measures had been taken against Jews. It's a longer passage in the diary, but it still appears in the movie. They're all wearing Jewish stars, which of course they take off when Peter wants to get rid of burn his Jewish star, and rejects it. She says, after all, it is the Star of David. And we know that Jews are being persecuted because when Dussel comes in, he says, right here in Amsterdam, every day hundreds of Jews are disappearing. Anne learns that one of her friends has been taken away, and she has a nightmare afterwards. And the nightmare has these women in concentration camp garb swaying at an appel, a roll call. And the scene is really haunting. And the reason the scene is haunting is it's from a movie about Auschwitz that the Poles made in 1948 called The Last Stage. It's uncredited, but it is definitely the scene from The Last Stage. So Stevens knew about these movies about Auschwitz and included it. But and there's also a scene where we see Jews being marched off, and a scene, by the way, which Spielberg took directly and used in Schindler's List. So there's a lot going on, and we know she's Jewish because they celebrate Hanukkah. And Anne was not particular. She described herself as not Orthodox, and she said they didn't make much fuss about Hanukkah. We just gave each other a few presents and lit candles. But the scene that's in the movie is much more extensive, including the story of the Maccabees and the singing of Rock of Ages. So in any case, the last scene, the criticism is, Anne's last scene is, we hear Anne saying, people are good at heart. But what do we hear before Anne says, people are good at heart? This is what we hear.
But in September, we were shipped to Poland, men to one camp, women to another. From there, they were sent to Belsen. I stayed in Auschwitz. In January, we were freed, the few of us who were left. The war was not yet over, no. It took us a long time to get home. Each time the train would stop, we'd all get out, at a siding or a crossing and walk from group to group. Where were you? Were you at Belsen? At Buchenwald? At Mauthausen? Where? Is it possible that you ever knew my wife? Did you ever see my husband? My son? My daughter? That's how I found out about my wife's death. Margot's, Van Daan's, Peter, Dussel. But Anna, I still hoped. Yesterday I was in Rotterdam. I met a woman there. She'd been in Belsen with Anna. I know now.
In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart.
She puts me to shame.
to sum up a little here. Assessing the Diary of Anne Frank, or many of these movies, by today's standards of Holocaust consciousness and what we expect in Holocaust movies and Jewish identity politics, overlooks the pioneering role of the diary, the play, and the movie in raising popular awareness of the catastrophe that had befallen European Jewry. In December of 1948, the International Association of Survivors of Concentration Camps, and it's 1959, of concentration camps and ghetto fighters in Israel conferred its Survivors Award on Stevens for his direction of the Diary of Anne Frank. And there's a number of other awards which he receives from Jewish organizations. I can read some of these later, but one of the things they did were do test previews and get audience responses. I've read through all the audience responses. There's hundreds of these cards. And though a lot of people are extreme, what did you like? Oh, I like the first kiss. I like this. A lot of people say the Hanukkah scene. A lot of people say when Mr. Dussel comes in. A lot of people say that it's the scene where she sees her girlfriend swaying. So audiences picked up on what they wanted to pick up. Here's one comment. My only comment is that I hope people will not just think that this is a good movie, but will hope that we have matured enough to stop killing the Anne Franks of the world. Bigotry, hate, and injustice must end. So placing these films within the context of the post-war period and the evolving consciousness of what the Holocaust entailed makes us look a little bit different. These directors operated under the production code, which didn't get scrapped until the 1960s. And so the depictions of graphic violence were limited. It was an era when the melting pot ideal still prevailed over the ethnic assertiveness, which has come to characterize identity politics in the United States. And most Americans were just starting to grapple with the nature and extent of the Holocaust, which had been relegated at the Nuremberg trials and in many places to one of many crimes. That's why I mentioned the 6 million thing. You don't see that figure much. I found it mentioned in one of the movies about the Nuremberg trials, one of the documentaries made, in one line. But in almost all the other documentaries that came out from the Signal Corps, the number is given as 20 million, as 30 million. In fact, The Search was the first time I found in a movie it saying 6 million with this placard that said 6 million died. So we have to look at this. And so initially we view this, how did we relate to this? Well, we were the good guys. That starts to erode a bit and we start getting Jewish characters, and it's a more troubled history in the 1950s. But it isn't until the 60s when things begin to change, where you have the Eichmann trial, which televises it. I know that's one of my first memories of watching the Eichmann trial as a boy. The social turmoil of the 60s and Vietnam and the comparisons that were made, the Supreme Court decisions I've mentioned, and the changes in the way movies are made for just general audiences until the 60s when you start developing much more adult fare. So I think all of those things need to be taken into context when we judge these movies. They lay the foundations, and you can see sort of the origins, like in The Juggler to the Pawnbroker, or in the movies I didn't show about the trials. You can see the beginnings of some of the movies that would then come out in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So thank you.
Let me say thank you very much, Larry, for a very interesting and fascinating presentation. I feel like I want to take the rest of the course now. And I thought it was very important. I'd like to ask you one of the questions. I'd like to suggest to the audience that we have a couple of minutes. We're going to run over our normal 1 hour, but I have nobody who doesn't think that this has been worth spending the time on. I want to ask you a question that's being asked by Joe Marks to everyone. Do you think more recent films such as Son of Saul, Life is Beautiful, Bag of Marbles, Schindler's List, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas are more realistic and positive representations of the Holocaust? let me change one word because positive is not a word we can possibly use. So let's use the word more authentic, realistic, etc. And there's been a great question in the chat room as to the nature of the boy in the striped pajamas. But why don't you answer that question? We'll take a couple of more, and I'm being urged to continue this, but we'll continue it only for another 5 or 6 minutes.
Well, my book about this is a book which it's called Projecting the Holocaust into the Present. And I look at each decade, and there's shifts in each decade, and basically Holocaust movies follow patterns that are in general in the society. So as movies become more frank and more graphic movie violence, you get more of that. And as identity politics becomes more central, you get Jewish characters being more central to the plots of Holocaust movies. And so I think, yes, undoubtedly, movie, it's hard to imagine a movie like Son of Saul, in the earlier period, when you think, and there were movies being made in Europe about concentration camps. We forget that. Right after the war, the one I mentioned, The Last Stage, is a rather remarkable, made by a woman who was in Auschwitz, with prisoners who were in Auschwitz, filmed in Auschwitz, but done from a very communist perspective. But nonetheless, they're being made, or movies like Capo. That sort of thing of more graphic violence took a while for American movies to get into, and when they get into it, they perhaps overdo it with other things. But I think a lot of these movies do a good job. Son of Saul is one of the brilliant ones. This one that I love, which is again a post-war one, 1945, I think is an amazing movie. If people haven't seen 1945,
we should also point out these are 2 Hungarian movies made by Hungarian filmmakers that are being done at precisely a time where nationalism is overwhelming and trying to transform the story of the Holocaust. And 1945, ironically, Son of Saul takes you into the heart of the gas chambers. It deals with the Zucker commando. And the other part of 1945, it really talks about how the presence of Jews triggers all of these repressed feelings. So it's really enormously important culturally within Germany. Let me ask a couple of more questions.
Let's just say about Boy in Striped Pajamas, I think there's, among Holocaust scholars, there's an agreement. It's not a good movie to use because it's the whole concept of it is so erroneous that this boy who's in a concentration camp could be talking to a kid and the guards would do nothing and that they would be playing. And so I guess for kids to see themselves sort of thrust into that situation that they may get involved in their playmate story and want to be involved in it, it might move them, but it's really a difficult story. And when it was as a book, it's mentioned that this is something like it's a myth or this is not true, kind of like Life is Beautiful. This is a fable, but in the movie, there's no mention that this is a fable. So it gets taken as realism and it just isn't, I think it's a bad movie to teach with.
Yeah. The other thing we should say is that a couple of things. George Stevens was deeply committed to the Holocaust itself. He took at his own expense colored film footage at a time colored film footage was rare. And it's really some of the best color film footage we have of the Holocaust. But there's also another side to it. I just edited a book by Anita Epstein, who was the number 2 person, the late Anita Epstein, who was the number 2 person who almost got the part of the Diary of Anne Frank. And she was convinced to her dying day that since she was a child survivor of the Holocaust as a hidden child, she was convinced that George Steam was afraid that her story might overwhelm Anne's story. So it's an intriguing story. Let's ask one more question. We need powerful movies to address anti-Semitism today. Give voice to the compelling story of the modern state of Israel and its struggle against anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish hatred and propaganda. I guess what we really need is what really hit the core in the 1950s, which was the movie Exodus.
Yeah, let me go to the first one because I noticed someone, I'm looking at the chat, and someone mentioned the movie Focus. They didn't know the name, but they were talking Arthur Miller's play about anti-Semitism, about a guy who all he changes is his appearance is wearing glasses, and now everyone thinks he's Jewish. It's an interesting movie. And these movies about anti-Semitism, that's a whole nother lecture. I give a lecture just on movies about anti-Semitism. And I think we could use them, but it's funny. When I was teaching, I showed Gentleman's Agreement every year, and you might think that movie is dated, but it absolutely shocked my students that this happened. And I have this memory, a very strong memory of being advised in 1964. I'm going to graduate in 65, and having a college counselor tell me, and I had applied to this school and that school, and said, well, you're not going to get into this school because they have a Jewish quota. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that. In 65, the Civil Rights Law is passed, so that quota theoretically or legally goes away. So.
And you have a name that can pass.
Yeah.
Birnbaum was not quite like that.
Right.
Or Schwarzenegger. Ladies and gentlemen.
But they used to, I don't know if you remember this, you probably do. They used to require you to send not only send pictures of yourself, I think that was one of the ways, but to send your mother's maiden name. That was another, So,
yes, I remember that distinctly. Let me say this has been a very enlightening, very interesting session. I thought I knew a lot, and I want to thank you, Larry, because every time I'm with you, I learn something new, and this was a very, very special session. We want to thank again Sharon Hurwitz and Danny Reed and the memorial, the Holocaust Memorial of Miami Beach for a series of stimulating programs. And we thank you for being the audience that tuned in and made this worthwhile, because we do this for you. And we hope that you appreciated the quality of what we've had available, present company, myself excluded, but we've had terrific sessions. And
can I ask you a question? Can we go over a little after this so I can hit some of these questions? I'm looking at them.
Sure, we can go over.
Okay. Because I'm seeing someone asked me about The Shop on Main Street. I think is a brilliant movie, and that's 1964. This is pretty early. You do get these much better European movies. Certainly, U.S. movies about the Holocaust aren't particularly good for a long time, but you start getting some really amazing movies coming out.
And again, that's a Czechoslovakian
movie, and it's made in part as a criticism of the Soviet Union,
which is not communist, hardcore communist,
right?
And at least in the artistic community, is rebelling against the narrative that was being imposed by communism.
Right. So it's a brilliant movie.
Danny, can you take over, because I have a dental obligation.
Okay.
That has to take place, but Danny Reed is going to take over.
Oh, great. Terrific.
As long as you want to go, and as long as the audience stays with us, we're happy to. We're honored to have you.
Well, I'm looking at the questions, and thank you again for inviting me. And I hope it isn't a root canal.
I hope so too. Danny, do you want to take over?
Sure. Go right ahead.
Okay, so I'm looking at some of these questions. Someone asked me about The Night Porter. Kind of a kinky movie, but it's sort of going into my thing of these movies reflect the decades they're made in. The 1970s is the decade of porn becoming mainstream. And The Night Porter, there's a whole number, I don't know how many of you know this, but there's a whole series of movies. I wouldn't include The Night Porter in this, which I call Pornocaust. They exploded. The Italians made most of them. They were called the Nasties. But they use concentration camps, create sexual situations of bondage and rape and all sorts of things. And they were very popular in the 70s and 80s. And The Night Porter is one of the most respectable versions of that, but certainly an important movie in dealing with repressed memories. And again, this image of the kind of psychologically wounded survivor, which until really the 1970s and 1980s, you don't see survivors portrayed in very positive ways. And so, and this falls into the other category. And then someone asked me about the Colonel and Me, with Danny Kaye, taken from Friedrich Dürrenmatt. It's actually not Friedrich Dürrenmatt, it's from Franz Werfel's play, Jakubowski and the Colonel. And Werfel didn't like it. He thought it was too light, but it had played on Broadway in 1944, so it played in Broadway and during the war. So. But it's good, and Danny Kaye won a Golden Globe for Best Comedic Actor for it. Other questions that people have, I'm going through here.
Lawrence, I'm sorry, for some reason I can't enable my video, but if we can we have one question that I saw that somebody asked about the Exodus, and there is associations obviously with the Holocaust there, and some of the subplots deal with that. Can you speak on that for a couple minutes?
Definitely. Well, there's now a couple of books just on the making of Exodus. But I'd say, if you want to look for the origins of Exodus, you should look for it in a movie called Sword in the Desert, a 1949 movie, the first American movie made in Israel or in Palestine. And it has an American captain, kind of hard-bitten character, not unlike the Humphrey Bogart character in The African Queen, who's paid to bring Holocaust survivors and smuggle them illegally into Palestine. They, of course, get captured. Some of them make it, and then it's about the struggle, and in the process of the struggle for independence, he becomes part of it. So it's really about Americans becoming, adopting Israel as their cause. And Exodus is very much in that line. I mean, you have Kitty becoming, she becomes the American stand-in who's going to, adopt this as her cause. And of course, Paul Newman as the ultimate sort of Jew who doesn't look Jewish and who wins over the bluest and blondest woman in the world. That gave me, growing up, I was 13 and I was given free tickets to see Exodus because I got bar mitzvah that year. And I remember when I saw him kiss Eva Marie Saint, I said, there's hope for me still, yes. But it does deal with it, but it does it in a very American way because you have the two poles. You have Karen, who's a product of the Jews being rescued in Denmark and is very positive, child of light, if you remember. And then you could have Dove, who's was in the camps, was in the ghettos, and who kind of daring in 1960, it's hinted that he was homosexually used by the guards, and that's used to explain why the Irgund appealed to him. And so, it's a very powerful movie, and it is probably the single most important movie, other than maybe Fiddler on the Roof in gaining sympathy for Jews and for a mass audience, undoubtedly.
I'd like to conclude with just one last question. And the question from Betty Lowenstein, she asks, what do you think of The Shop on Main Street?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant movie. It's very brave in that it deals with collaboration. And most movies in Europe weren't, most European countries weren't willing to deal with the subject of collaboration for a long time. So it isn't about the Germans, it's really about the Czechs, or in this case, the Slovaks. And so it's a very powerful movie. And yet it's also a movie that when I show it, it has these comical elements to it that lighten it up. The way he's henpecked, his relationship with the woman who owns the store, and that she doesn't understand the things that he's saying. And she thinks, she doesn't understand how imperiled she is. I think it's brilliant. And it was a movie, as Michael was saying, that was made at a time, it's right during the thaw, when there's a little bit of an easing of Soviet restrictions. It's 4 years before the Czech springtime, but it was made as a protest against Soviet rule. So the building of that tower is kind of a metaphor for the Soviet Union as well. And that, by the way, is not uncommon in some of the movies that came out of Eastern Europe both in the late 40s and in the 60s. So it's the first major film to win at least a major award, first Holocaust film to win a major award. One of my side projects is about the Holocaust and the Oscars. And it becomes, if you notice, if you look at all the films that Hollywood has recognized that are Holocaust films, the majority of them are foreign films. It's almost like a kind of outsourcing. We're going to give it to you because this is where it happened. And it's more direct, you're more directly involved. And so there's all these foreign films that have won the award, the Holocaust films that have won the Oscar for Best Foreign Film.
All right, very good. I think that's a good place to conclude for the evening. Lawrence, Professor Barron, I want to thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you everybody else for joining us. We did record this, so we'll be sharing it if anybody else would like to see it again.
Do you post this on the memorial website?
Yeah, we'll post it on our YouTube channel, but also I will be sending out the handouts to everybody immediately following the conclusion of this program. So thank you everybody for joining us. Really do appreciate it. Professor Barron, thank you again. Good night, everybody.
Good night.